Hey everyone, I'm Steve from GamersNexus.net, and we're here to talk about our Overwatch GPU benchmark that we ran over the weekend. There was another Overwatch beta weekend. So, big disclaimer here, it is in beta, or it was at least in beta, and that means nothing's finalized, optimizations aren't done, and drivers aren't done from NVIDIA or AMD. So at this point, all of the performance metrics are, or should be, temporary, and that's because the driver support's not there and the game's not optimized fully. So what you see here is not necessarily applicable to the game as it launches. If you're watching this in 2016, then maybe check and see if we've done an updated benchmark to make sure that the optimizations haven't changed things substantially. But still, the game is fairly playable across most GPUs in our test suite, and that's what you'll see here today. So it's a decent title in terms of scalability across GPUs. And the main thing here is that Blizzard's got a fairly useful settings menu where you have good control over the options. And in our initial settings test, where we look at delta between different setting options, there is actually a pretty big disparity between some of the less useful settings, which means that you can get a good amount of FPS out of something without necessarily losing a noticeable amount of fidelity if you are on a lower end GPU. So let's dive into it here. We already released the benchmark course on the channel. It's less than 2 minutes, the video. The course itself is 30 seconds, and you can see that if you want to replicate our results or try and see where we got our data. The course was done in single player to eliminate a lot of variables, a ton of variables. We always do single player where possible. And in limited testing for internal use at Gamers Nexus, we found that the delta for single player versus multiplayer was generally pretty low. So even with the added characters, we weren't seeing a huge amount of impact to frame rate. And that's a good thing. That means our tests are easier to scale and reproduce. The only time there was a big impact was when sort of everyone converged on one spot and there was a lot of action, a lot of effects going on at the same time. In those cases, there was an FPS impact of a couple percent. But overall, this is a pretty reliable test for multiplayer and single player. The items and the settings to look out for include primarily render scale. So render scale just super samples and downsamples the rendered resolution to the screen. That's all it really does. And render scale comes in a couple different flavors. So there's a low, which is a 50% scale. That means you're downsampling your resolution quite a bit, down 50% from what it would natively be, which is 100%. There is medium at 75%, high at 100%. That's what we ran these on and what you should probably run them on, unless you're on a setting where you want to super sample. Ultra 150% and epic at 200%. What that means is if you run ultra and you're on a 1080 display, you're effectively rendering a 1440 output. So that's similar to DSR and VSR from NVIDIA and AMD. And epic at 200% is effectively a 4K output if you're on a 1080 monitor. And this has the impact of just running natively at 1440 or 4K. So if you do the render scale at ultra or epic, there will be a performance hit to the same tune of a resolution increase. It's about the same. The next item, anti-aliasing, is listed as low, medium, high, and ultra, which is a little confusing. So what these mean: low is FXAA, which is kind of the blurrier but very performance-friendly setting. Medium is SMAA, low quality. I'm not sure how many taps that is. I'm guessing it's probably 2x. High is medium quality, probably 4x, and ultra is high quality, which is going to be probably 8x or 16x. We haven't confirmed those numbers yet. The initial settings comparisons we did look at a couple of the different settings in the game and compare them across multiple resolutions. So the biggest impact to a setting performance-wise is going to be changing the render scale. And if you run epic, it's basically 4 times the resolution that you're rendering if you're at 1080. So or actually at any resolution, because it's a 200% increase. So render scale is the first thing to look at for improving performance. Ambient Inclusion has about an 8.5% FPS impact, and disabling this reduces the apparent depth of things like foliage and trees and buildings. It reduces the shading and depth of, or appearance of depth on objects as surfaces connect. If you have a wall like that or something that's kind of sticking out more than another, then the ambient inclusion value will affect that, and it's an 8.5% performance hit. Refractions, effectively 0 FPS impact. We need to further research that. Local reflections, again, negligible impact, effectively 0 FPS. That's things like mirrors and mirror-like surfaces, metallic surfaces. Texture, filter quality is normally something like anisotropic filtering, which generally has about a 0 performance impact, but in this case we saw a 3.7% delta between max and off, and that helps with the application of textures on non-oblique angled surfaces. Dynamic reflections was a huge impact on FPS. So at the max versus high range, we saw a hit of about 29%. At the high versus medium range, we saw 13%, and at medium versus low, we saw almost 15% performance hit. So that's the second place to go after render scale. AA quality, couple FPS between settings, so that's really not a big hit right now, but that may change and we'll research it more. Our first set of charts here shows the preset scalability testing. So this is an internal test we always conduct, but I decided to publish it this time. And this shows relative performance across a single configuration, just the 980 Ti, and it shows deltas between frame rates at low, medium, high, ultra, and epic, and that informs our decision on which settings to test for the final benchmark, because we can't do them all realistically. The first chart shows the delta loss and gain from setting to setting, and this is only one chart, so you're only looking at the average FPS. You don't see 1% and 0.1% lows here, and this shows ultra as our established go-to setting. That's why you see it at 100%. That's effectively what we're considering normal for this test, what we think most people will be running. And if you look at the scaling here, ultra is about 26% faster than epic, which scales up a few of the settings, and it's about 30% slower than high, with low allowing almost anything to play Overwatch. But note here that we were hitting 300 FPS, which is the game's cap right now, so it might actually be an even bigger gap between low and medium, depending on where it's capping out on FPS. 4K, for the first benchmark, we're looking at the 4K charts. This is obviously a pretty heavy hitter on the GPU suite. Reducing the render scale to medium, which is a 75% render, pushes FPS about 20 to 30 FPS higher across these cards on the 980 Ti especially, but at that point you're basically reducing your resolution, so it's worth considering dropping to 1440p natively. There's currently no SLI profile from what we've gathered. I'm getting some crossfire tests done in the next beta, so we'll figure out if there's any scaling there, but SLI performance shows 0 scaling across all resolutions and presets tested right now, which means that you're seeing these results where it's kind of unplayable at these settings with 4K. You have to either drop the settings substantially or just reduce the resolution of play. Overwatch is a game where you really want close to 60 FPS because it does start to feel jarring and weird at 50, even 55 FPS. So I would try to target 60 here. Running Epic with a high render scale, 1440p resolution is a lot less brutal to the GPUs than the 4K resolution test, which is 4.6 million pixels more than 1440, so it makes sense. The game runs reliably with high frame rates from the 390X and up, including the 970, the 390X of course, the 980, and the 980 Ti, and these R9 290X runs close enough that some minor tweaks would push it over the top, but low 0.1% frame times hammer AMD's cards across all of the Overwatch tests. So this is an optimization level issue either on Blizzard's end or AMD's driver side, and is something that should be seriously considered. I would not base potentially a GPU purchase on these results right now, because as drivers roll out, this 0.1% hit that exists on AMD and not NVIDIA should potentially be reduced. At 1080 Epic, that's probably what a lot of you will be running, if not 1080 Ultra. This shows how well Blizzard's Overwatch plays on most hardware at 1080p, and AMD again suffers from poor 1% low and 0.1% low frame delivery, but averages are up across the board for all cards. The drops do hit harder on AMD hardware though. Optimization should resolve this going forward, but looking at the other stuff, everything from the GTX 960 and up, including the 380X, which is brand new, the 970, the 290X, and so forth, can run Overwatch reliably at 60 FPS with 1080p Epic, and the R9 285 is close enough that we'd consider it within striking range if you made some tweaks. And this is a look at the 1080p Ultra chart, which is a lot more forgiving on the cards. You can see that the lower end hardware, including even the 950, starts to enter decent playability range. So what's the best video card for Overwatch? It depends on your settings, of course. Right now at 1080p, it's fairly playable on the GTX 960, which is 170 at 2 gigabytes, 200 plus at 4 gigabytes. The R9 380, another $200-ish card, or the R9 380X, which is brand new and is a couple percent higher average performance than the NVIDIA cards at the competing price range, but has worse low frame times. At 1440, we shift our recommendations toward the R9 390X, and the GTX 970, which has been on pretty crazy sales lately, about $290, with the 970 performing significantly higher in 0.1% lows. So that is definitely something to consider, but again, it's a beta, so that might change. 4K is effectively unplayable right now. As the SLI and Crossfire profiles come out, as the game's optimized, that might change. If you want to play 4K right now, you've got to do it on a high-end hardware, so that'd be a 980 Ti or Fury X or similar, which we do not have a Fury X for testing right now. And you would still have to drop your settings from Ultra or Epic down to something like medium or a mix of medium and high, which is not really something that feels great to do, but it would allow 4K to be more playable on a mix of high and medium and maybe one or two ultra settings. So you have to do a lot of tuning there to get that working properly right now. But that is all for this benchmark. Check the channel for all the other stuff, and of course the benchmark course that we already ran to see the max graphics output of Overwatch if you're curious what it looks like. And check the Patreon link if you want to help us produce more of this content. That'll be down here in the post-roll video. I will see you all next time.